For almost 200 years, blood has been shed continuously in the Middle East in the name of God. In the minds of people who have never studied history in depth, the Crusaders are often portrayed as people who, driven by their religious beliefs or, to be more cynical, greed, decided to conquer Jerusalem and all its surroundings. This view is reinforced by the idea that they were driven out by Muslims who were hostile to the Christian world and who were supposedly not worth pitying because they were clear and traditional enemies. I declare with full responsibility, all this is a gross and, most importantly, terrible simplification, even by my standards, because I, in essence, do nothing but make gross simplifications. Let's start with the absurd belief that the Islamic world was extremely hostile to all of Christianity. Firstly, there was no single Islamic world in the 11th century when Europeans set out for the Holy Land. Islam, officially founded in 610 by the Prophet Muhammad, who is believed to have recorded the revelations revealed to him by Allah in the sacred text of the Quran, had already come a long way by that time. During his lifetime, he was engaged in converting pagans to the new, correct faith, and in 632 he conquered his birthplace, Mecca, making it the capital of a new, young religion ready for great deeds. The Arab tribes of Arabia joyfully embraced the new religion, especially since it legitimized their desire to conquer everything and everyone. Arab sages and interpreters of the sacred text divided the world into two very convenient parts, Dar al-Islam, House of Peace, and Dar al-Harb, House of War. The House of Peace is the territory where Islam, the correct and acceptable faith, is practiced. The House of War is all other lands where the wrong faith is practiced. This meant that it was necessary to bring them the right faith as soon as possible so that all these fools who did not live according to the right religious laws would not end up in some wrong place after death. In general, they were doing a good and noble deed, which, incidentally, was indeed perceived as such by many. It is important to note that Islam was not spread solely through conquest. Modern researchers have every reason to believe that some people who converted to Islam, or Christianity, in those years did not see any significant difference between them. This points to much more complex processes of cultural and religious interaction than simply military conflicts. However, conquests were certainly an important process in the first centuries after Muhammad's death. His followers founded the Caliphate, essentially a theocratic empire that began to spread rapidly throughout the Middle East. And here one might say, well, that explains it. A new, young, aggressive empire with a new religion has captured Jerusalem. What, it would seem, could be a better reason for the Crusades? However, let's start with the fact that by the 11th century, the idea of a holy war in Islam had greatly lost its popularity. Relations between Muslim states and the Christian world were much more complex than simple confrontation. There were periods of coexistence, trade, cultural exchange, as well as internal conflicts and divisions in both the Christian and Muslim worlds. It was these internal dynamics and interactions between different Muslim entities, and not just their relationship with Christianity, that played a key role in shaping that historical landscape. However, let's start with the fact that by the 11th century, the idea of holy war in Islam had greatly lost its popularity. The thing is that in Islam there are two concepts of jihad, the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is, of course, not war in the usual sense, but a war against one's own sinful nature, a war that takes place within oneself, self-improvement, spirituality, and so on. The lesser jihad, on the other hand, is a holy war against infidels. And although in the first 150 years or so, such a war was indeed very active, and the caliphate expanded rapidly, Islam eventually reached a certain limit of expansion. It was previously believed that its spread was halted by the battles in Byzantium or the legendary victory of Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers, but why this concept is not seen as overly mythologized and why it is now actively disputed by modern historians could be the subject of a separate video. Personally, I find it more likely that certain internal complexities and structural problems within the caliphate itself had a greater impact on the halt of Islamic expansion than external factors alone. But either way, the fact remains, by the middle of the 8th century, Islam had settled within certain existing borders. And here we move on to secondly. Secondly, by the 11th century, the caliphate was no longer what it had been, and naturally, there was no longer a united front of Islam. The problems began as early as 661, when the last righteous caliph, Ali ibn Abu Talib, the Prophet's cousin, died during a civil war. As a result of this struggle, the Umayyad dynasty came to power and ruled the caliphate until the middle of the 8th century. More importantly, during this civil war, a group of people broke away from mainstream Islam, believing that the Umayyads had no right to rule because only the descendants of the Prophet, or more precisely, the descendants of Caliph Ali ibn Abu Talib and his wife Fatima, could be the legitimate heirs to the caliphate. These people later became known as Shiites. It is interesting to note that what ultimately became the largest religious schism in the Islamic world began with what was essentially a political issue of succession to the throne. In any case, Islam as a religion would never be whole again. In the 8th century, the Umayyads were replaced by the Abbasids, who built the city of Baghdad and made it their new capital, finally moving the center of the largest Islamic state away from the so-called Holy Land, which now, in general, would represent a kind of periphery and border zone. Especially since there was someone to demarcate. In the 8th century, the Moors, the Islamic rulers of Spain and western North Africa, became independent of the caliphs, and in the 10th century, the powerful Shiite state of the Fatimid dynasty finally emerged, seizing power over the most fertile parts of North Africa, conquering Egypt, Syria, and temporarily Lebanon, forever defining themselves as eternal enemies of the Abbasids, who represented the Sunni wing of Islam. At the same time, the Seljuk Turks appeared on the historical arena and in the Sunni corner of the ring. First forming an alliance with the Abbasid Caliph, and then founding their own sultanate in Asia Minor, becoming the main problem of Eastern Rome for centuries, but ultimately the cause of its demise. Everything that happened next is very difficult to call a single, unified war between Muslims and Christians. Yes, they fought each other in Spain, and yes, the Byzantines fought the Turks in Asia Minor, but these processes were in no way connected. Moreover, their nature was more secular than religious. By the 11th century, the caliph was still the main religious figure in Islam, but secular entities, sultanates and emirates, had already begun to become the main political force. I have already mentioned that the idea of holy war was not as popular at the beginning of the so-called High Middle Ages as it was at the time of the emergence of Islam, but it should also be added that there had never been any direct confrontation between Christianity and Islam before that. Islam and Christianity are two very similar monotheistic Abrahamic religions. They are as closely related to each other as they are to Judaism, and Muslims themselves refer to both Jews and Christians as people of the book or people of the scripture. In other words, Christians and Jews are not seen by Muslims as some kind of wild pagans, but rather as dudes who got the general idea right but messed up the details. What can we say? If Sunnis and Shiites consider each other heretics and fought much more fiercely than Muslims and Christians often did before the Crusades, of course. Moreover, even during the era of the most aggressive expansion of the Caliphate and the spread of Islam, Muslims, for example, did not force Christians and Jews in their new lands to change their faith. However, they compensated for this tolerance with high taxes, but nevertheless. So, as you can see, despite the constant border conflicts between the Latin world and the Middle East, there was no question of any global confrontation between Christianity and Islam. Let us now consider this from a European perspective. In fact, much of the above can be applied to Christians as well: feudalism and weak centralization of power even in large kingdoms, heterogeneity of the faith itself, and so on. Yes, Christianity would finally split into Orthodoxy and Catholicism only in the 11th century, but countless contradictions within it would have been accumulating for centuries by that point. Finally, the constant struggle between the Roman popes and the Holy Roman Emperors had already become a medieval meme in itself. The question of who should control church resources was a perennial subject of dispute between popes and German emperors. I will dwell on this in more detail later. But here is what is important to say now: if in Islam we see how the idea of a holy war for the faith gradually lost its popularity and significance, then in Christianity we see the exact opposite process. There, a religion that was initially quite peaceful, in fact, increasingly recalled quotes in the spirit of "I did not bring you peace, but a sword," that is, by the very presence of this phrase in the text of the Bible, we, of course, guessed that some possibility of armed struggle for the faith was assumed. But was this the norm? If the righteous caliphate brought religion on the tips of swords and spears, Christianity took a rather nimble path from a marginal sect to the major league and the main state of the Roman Empire, among other things. And although there were some bloody moments, Rome was generally lucky. Christianity was not imposed on it by war, but spread relatively peacefully throughout its territory. So, on the whole, its expansion was not so warlike in nature. It was only after the fall of Rome, when new barbarian kingdoms were forming on its ruins, that Christianity began to engage in all sorts of discussions, for example, with the help of St. Augustine. It was his ideas about just war, bellum iustum, that became the cornerstone for future justifications of violence in the name of faith. Augustine, of course, did not call for total slaughter, but his interpretations allowed him to argue that war against pagans was not really war, that killing a person of another faith was not exactly murder, and that shedding blood for the faith was not only possible but sometimes necessary. All this fit very well with the mood of the new Christian rulers, who yesterday were barbarians and today were already kings of the new European kingdoms, so to speak. Their unbridled energy and thirst for land and power now found a divine justification. And so it began. However, throughout the early and even the central Middle Ages, Christian theologians of all stripes continued to argue about the extent to which it was permissible to shed blood for Christ. You know, all these interesting interpretations of the commandment "thou shalt not kill" in the spirit of "thou shalt not kill, unless it is a heretic," or "thou shalt not kill, well, if you really want to, then you can," and similar sophisms that attempted to reconcile the gospel ideal of peace with the cruel reality of political struggle and territorial claims. So what changed if there was no confrontation, but theologians were arguing? There is an opinion that the whole problem was in Jerusalem. But there are some inconsistencies. Jerusalem came under the rule of Islamic rulers as early as the 7th century, and the First Crusade began only in the 11th century. Inconsistency. The main initiator and beneficiary of these holy wars was the papacy, which in the 11th century was determined to reform itself. The ultimate goal of the reform was, of course, to increase the power and authority of the Roman popes. The main superhero of this period was Pope Gregory VII, who was the first to pull out a 500-year-old text written by St. Augustine and began waving it around, calling for a holy war against the Turks in order to help his Christian brothers in Constantinople. This was, in essence, a PR stunt, a nice way to show who was the boss among the church patriarchs. And, apparently, to casually subjugate the Eastern Roman clergy, that is, the Orthodox Church. But anyway, he did many other interesting things. For example, it was thanks to him that Christianity saw the emergence of simony, the sale of church offices, church relics, and all sorts of other similar things. So when some priest today consecrates something for $1 and a Mercedes, it is thanks to Gregory VII, who, despite his good intentions to reform the church, actually legitimized a practice that gave rise to a huge number of abuses. So that others would not feel too offended, he nevertheless offered the world compensation and forbade priests to marry. Yes, celibacy is also his invention. Although I suspect that this was done not so much out of purity of morals as to solve the problem of inheriting the enormous wealth and land that had been obtained thanks to the previous point, that is, so that church property would not slip out of the church's control into the hands of priests' heirs. But the main issue remained the question of investiture: who should appoint bishops, and thus receive all kinds of deductions, interest, and other perks from them. Gregory fiercely conflicted with Emperor Henry IV over this right. The Pope deposed the Emperor, and the Emperor responded by deposing the Pope. The Emperor excommunicated him from the Church, and there was a considerable war, the outcome of which is best not to recall. What is important for us is that Gregory VII did not end well, dying in exile. However, he did one thing that was very important for us. Thanks to his reforms, the papal powers expanded so much that one of his subsequent successors was able to declare a crusade with the aim of establishing the authority of the papacy and, importantly, improving its financial situation in the potentially near future. After all, the Holy Land beckoned with riches that could be used to strengthen Rome's influence. But as a one-off branding campaign, this call turned into a couple of centuries of holy wars that changed the face of the Middle East and Europe forever. But as a one-time branding campaign, this call turned into a couple of centuries of holy wars that changed the face of the Middle East and Europe forever. The fact is that the First Crusade was incredibly successful. We talked about this a long time ago in one of our old videos. It was truly a unique case. The secret of its success lay in the fact that it began at a time when the Middle East was torn apart by the very internal contradictions I mentioned earlier, the Fatimids and Abbasids, the wars between them, the Seljuk fragmentation, and so on. In addition, as I have already said, the territory of Jerusalem, Syria, and so on was not at all the center of the Islamic world. It was much further away, at least if we are talking about the Sunnis, who made up the majority of Muslims. The Holy Land, which the Crusaders invaded, was already a border zone, constantly contested by various factions. Although all subsequent crusades to the Holy Land were largely unsuccessful, the number of people wishing to go there did not diminish. Why? Firstly, it promised potentially significant benefits: land, spoils, prestige. Many European feudal lords, burdened with debt or dreaming of expanding their holdings, saw the Crusades as a chance for enrichment and social advancement. Secondly, participation in the crusade acted as an absolution of all sins, a powerful incentive for devout, and not so devout, Christians who feared the torments of hell. In addition, the Holy Land, perpetually engulfed in the flames of war, solved the problem of surplus feudal lords. All these younger sons, who did not have enough land, did not receive an inheritance, and did not want to become priests or monks, gladly went on the Crusades, considering it a worthy alternative to idleness and sponging off their more fortunate relatives. Incidentally, thanks to a similar mechanism, the Greeks settled all the coasts of all the neighboring and surrounding seas in their time. I talked about this in the video about Phanagoria when I spoke about the Great Greek colonization. Naturally, centuries of religious wars exacerbated all possible interreligious and intercultural conflicts and differences. Considering that medieval society, in which people could not leave their native villages for generations, was quite accustomed to xenophobia and distrust of strangers, all this was compounded by universal religiosity. In this sense, the hostile nature of the High Middle Ages was largely shaped by the Crusades, among other things. They not only exploited existing prejudices, but also actively shaped them, creating an image of the enemy based on religion. But they also shaped it in a completely different way. One of the main, and perhaps paradoxical, results of the Crusades was the constant, close, and intense contact between Western Europe and the Middle East. Previously, this contact had only been between the Eastern Mediterranean, between Byzantium and, in fact, Asia Minor and the Middle East. Now, thousands of Europeans, from aristocrats to simple peasants, saw a different culture, a different way of life, and different technologies for the first time in their lives. And when the Crusades finally ended, the hostility between the two religions, which had been inflated and sustained for centuries, very quickly returned to normal. Yes, there were some conflicts, yes, there were some hostile moments and situations related to religion, and yes, as I already said, in the Middle Ages, people generally did not like strangers and people who were not very similar to them. But it still wasn't a war between two sides, the alliance with the horde or the bugs with humanity. Because the benefits of cooperation turned out to be a much more important result. The West began to actively trade with the East, bringing not only money but also invaluable knowledge to Christian countries. The notorious Arabic numerals appeared in Europe, replacing the inconvenient Roman ones, as well as the achievements of Arabic astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics, which had far more far-reaching consequences for the development of European civilization than any conquests. It was through the Arab world that Europeans rediscovered many of the works of ancient Greek thinkers that had been lost in the West. But why do many of us still perceive the Crusades as a global conflict that brought nothing but war to our world? More importantly, why does this global conflict seem natural to many? The reason lies in the mythologization that began in the mid-18th century. When history, archaeology, and many other sciences began to develop actively, and with them the possibilities for mass communication and propaganda, various political forces of all stripes, colors, and shades began to use the image and narrative of the Crusades for their own manipulative purposes. European nationalists, Middle Eastern nationalists, religious radicals of all stripes, rulers who needed to justify their expansionist policies, who didn't use crusading rhetoric for nothing. From Catherine II, who dreamed of the Russian flag flying over Constantinople, to similar fantasies that the Russian Empire had during World War I, seeking to capture Constantinople under the guise of liberating the holy places. From Kaiser Wilhelm II's obsession with Saladin, who even poured money into the restoration of his tomb, to Osama bin Laden's obsession with Saladin, who used crusading rhetoric no less actively than, for example, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and other Islamic radicals were largely inspired by the historical heroes of Islam during the Crusades. However, these same heroes also inspired Voltaire, for example, who saw Saladin as a model of an enlightened ruler. And so this tendency toward historical parallelism, toward projecting contemporary conflicts onto events that took place thousands of years ago, has distorted our perception. Incidentally, note that I have not said anything about Israel, even though many people have also spoken about Israel in a far from pleasant manner in the context of the Crusades, drawing incorrect historical parallels. Nevertheless, it is precisely because of such manipulations and distortions of historical facts that we still believe, at least in the context of long-past wars and long-past events, that the global conflict between two religions that are very similar in character and nature, is something completely natural. And it is also thanks to such manipulations and distortions of historical facts that even now, in the 21st century, it is not so difficult to persuade someone to go to war for their faith with weapons in their hands, considering it their duty in the natural state of affairs. This concludes our story about the Crusades, a story not only about distant battles, but also about how the past shapes the present, how myths can be more powerful than facts, and how important it is to approach the interpretation of history critically so as not to become hostages to the manipulations of others. I would like to apologize in advance for any errors in the text or dubbing. I am still learning, and the language used on this channel is not my native language. The dubbing was done using artificial intelligence. Please point out any errors so that I can correct them and improve the quality of the content. I would also be happy if you shared your thoughts on the topic. Your support in the comments motivates me to continue searching for new interesting stories. Thank you for your understanding and participation. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories.